Space has a timeless allure. It's vast, mysterious, and may hold answers to questions about our very existence. Man's journey into space has been filled with incredible achievements, groundbreaking missions, and daring adventures. And the African continent is catching up. In the last few decades, it has made its mark in space exploration, from launching satellites with a wide variety of applications to developing homegrown space programs. So this week on the program, we look at the current status of Africa's space programs and the continent's potential to become a rising space power. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, Africa's first satellite was the Egyptian-owned Nilesat 101 in April 1998, followed by South Africa and its launch of Sunsat 1 in 1999. Since then, a total of 17 African countries have put more than 60 satellites into orbit. Before we begin our discussion, my colleague Julie Shire brings us more.
Over 60 satellites sent into orbit by African countries float among tens of thousands of other craft.
If we think back 40 to 50 years ago, it would cost on the order of billions of dollars to build and launch a satellite, usually the size of like a large bus. While nowadays you can build and launch a satellite for about 500,000. I mean, the size of the satellite these days is about the size of a Rubik's Cube, maybe slightly larger.
These spacecrafts make satellite TV, telecommunications, and navigation systems possible and are useful for weather forecasting, monitoring of the environment, sea routes, and crops.
You can get information about soil moisture. You can get information about pH levels in the crop, which allows then a farmer to know which parts of their farm need attention, which parts of the farm might need a certain fertilizer, and to better manage their farm to then get more productivity at the end of the day.
South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, and Algeria have led the continent's space venture, but smaller countries are also waking up to the benefits.
Countries like Mauritius, like Djibouti, Uganda, Zimbabwe, even Senegal, they recently launched their first satellite.
Africa has so far invested around $5 billion in satellite projects, but most satellites are built and launched by Western countries.
If you've got 20 billion worth of economic value, being created every year, if you're able to, keep a majority of that, that is going to catapult economic growth and development in Africa.
African countries are expected to send a further 70 satellites into orbit by 2030. The continent must, however, focus on developing manufacturing and launch facilities to cement its place in the space race. Julie Shire, CGTN, Cape Town.
Well, joining me now to unpack Africa's space ambitions are from Jilin in China, Xu Yansong, Director General of the Asia-Pacific Space Cooperation Organization; from Oyo in Nigeria, Temideo Oniosun, Founder and Managing Director of Space in Africa; and joining me here in Nairobi, Charles Mwangi, Acting Director, Space Sector and Technology Development at the Kenya Space Agency. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let me start off with you, Temideo, because currently there are more than 20 African countries that have space programs. And according to the African Space Agency, which was formally inaugurated last year, where do you place Africa right now in its space ambitions?
Thank you very much. Africa's space ambition is, I would say, still at the early phase. We've seen a lot of significant growth in the last couple of years. More countries are now developing space program, and African countries have launched about 61 satellites up to date, which is an impressive number if you look at the historical participation of Africa in global space development. We're also seeing an increase in how much money African governments are spending on their space program, with average annual budgets from the continent at about $500 million annually. Ultimately, the African space and satellite industry is growing, and it's now valued at close to $20 billion across multiple industry segments. We're still at the early phase, but we've seen significant progress over the last couple of years.
Right. I want to look at that multiple industry segments there. Charles, you know, what the Africa Space Agency is saying is that Africa's space industry could be worth about 22.6 billion by 2026, up from what Medeo is talking about, 20 billion today. What kind of space projects are African countries currently engaged in?
When you're looking at space, you're looking at two main dimensions. You look at what we call the upstream, which deals with satellite development, rocket development, how you get to the satellite to space. There's also the element now, once you get the satellite data, what you utilize it for. So in terms of the upstream, you have a number of countries that are working to develop spaceports. We have South Africa. Ourselves here in Kenya, we're also looking at how we can set up a spaceport that would allow us, again, allow Africa to gain access to space. There are also a number of projects that are focusing on satellite development. We have an AIT facility in Egypt that was recently launched. We have concurrent design facilities in Egypt, South Africa. We're also working on the possibility of setting up a CubeSat development center in Kenya. So in terms of the upstream, there is a lot of activity. Also in terms of satellite development, there is KwaZulu-Natal that is working on developing a rocket that would allow us now then to be able to access space. But also more importantly, in terms of the downstream, there is the ground receiver stations that then allow us to connect with the satellite and get the data that has been taken by the satellite. And a number of countries, Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, Ghana, Nigeria, and a number of other countries have already set up ground infrastructure that allows them to connect or collect data. And then, of course, now after you receive the data is how you process it. And a number of countries have really invested in terms of the infrastructure that is enabling them to be able to develop products and solutions that then are also used for decision support.
Director Xu, when we talk about developing technology, all these needs resources. Let's talk about partnerships, because it is key to realize Africa's space ambitions. In which areas, though, are China and Africa partnering in Africa's space programs? Are they partnering in Africa's space programs?
Quite extensively. I think starting from the telecommunication industry, we had a cooperation and joint development of a telecommunications satellite for Algeria and Nigeria, and also for AIT Center that just two gentlemen mentioned about in Egypt. We had also collaboration with Egypt on the provision of AIT integration and testing facilities in Egypt for academies, and joint research, and also established with Ethiopia on small satellite communications, and China, and also with South Africa, cooperating on the ground station, receiving station for remote sensing satellites decades ago. So there are extensive collaborations between China and African countries.
Talk to us about this extensive collaboration in this partnership. Which bit does China bring on the table, and what is Africa's input?
Well, I think China has a very good ambition in terms of developing satellites in areas of remote sensing, navigations, and telecommunications. And we'll also have extensive programs in deep space explorations. For example, the lunar missions and Mars missions, and sample return missions. All of these are fundamental for the collaborations, as China has rapidly developing its space programs, its access to space, its Chinese space station, as well as the navigation and remote sensing constellations. We know China has the biggest remote sensing constellations in the world. We have more than 400 satellites that's currently working in space, providing remote sensing data to ground. As you have mentioned, that these are going to be used for agriculture, food securities, city plannings, and many other domains, and also disaster management. Another key factors for African countries is that Africa should also unite all the nations in terms of space program development, so that to avoid duplications among member states in Africa, so that we can have more efficient investment in terms of the limited resource that we put into space.
So, Charles, Africa sent its first satellite into orbit more than 20 years ago. But when we look at Africa's space technology, it is still quite nascent. Why is Africa still lagging behind in space-related activities?
Beatrice, I think it's majorly an issue about awareness, and it's something that even at the Kenya Space Agency we are seeking to address. Sometimes the question that we get asked is, why are we investing in space, and then we have all these other issues around food security, disasters, issues around climate change. But one of the things that we miss out, and I think also it's also a gap from us as a technology people, we have not been able to communicate very well the benefit of space to the common person. And when you are allocating funding, the politicians who essentially do control a lot of that process, they have to understand the value proposition for space. And sometimes we've not been able to articulate that using cases or projects that they are able to pick out and identify with. Wow. And I think that is a challenge that we need to address as we go forward as African countries, especially those who have agencies. How do we demonstrate the value and, of course, create the awareness in terms of the returns of investment that the country would get from investing in space?
Temidayo, address that concern for us from the African citizenry that you know there are more pressing priorities for Africa, and that it cannot really waste its limited resources on lofty ideas and grandiose plans. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think that it is the responsibility of the various national space agencies to be able to communicate what they're doing to the citizens. And I think for more than 2 decades now, in some African countries, the government has been heavily investing in space. And I think for many people, they've not been able to see the direct impact of some of these investments. So it is the responsibility of these agencies to be able to translate the work that they're doing into something that the citizens actually understand. I don't think that African space program is necessarily lagging behind. I mean, I think if you look at, in terms of investment, Africa is probably just behind Europe, maybe the whole of Asia and the whole of North America. But there's a lot of investment going into space programs in Africa. African new space companies have also recently raised close to $200 million in investment. We've got companies in Africa building critical technologies that are powering some of these global space missions. You've got the SKA project ongoing in South Africa, which will become, the world's largest, ground-based telescope. So there's a lot of critical, project and infrastructure and even technologies that are ongoing in the continent. I think what African institutions need to pay more attention towards is actually translating these in languages that the general public would understand.
So, Charles, let's draw from your experience, because from Kenya's experience, so to say, because Kenya did send its first nano satellite into space in 2018. In 2023, Kenya launched its first operational satellite, Taifa 1, into space. Who exactly built these gadgets, and what are they doing out there in space?
We have had a mix of participation with Kenyan participants involved in the potentially in the design, and the launching has been done from outside the region, because we currently do not have launch systems. So for the first one, the first Kenyan nanosatellite, University nanosatellite precursor flight, which was launched in 2018, I was part of that team that was involved in its development. So we did the development, and then, of course, now in terms of the launch, it was done from the International Space Station. The next one, the Taifa one that was launched recently in 2023, the design and the development was done within the country. And then we had Endurosat in Bulgaria that did the fabrication, because again, most of the times you require space-grade equipment, and that to be integrated in a facility that meets a certain threshold. But much of the, apart from South Africa and Egypt, Algeria, much of the rest of the Africa, the fabrication is done outside the region, and there is need for investment in terms of the clean rooms and the like to allow us to be able to develop them here, because we see a lot of value chain that would be unlocked. We have seen a lot of companies, especially within South Africa, the likes of New Space, Cube Space, Sense and Dragonfly that are developing subsystems on the nanosatellite. But in terms of what they do in space, once they get into space, they have different missions. The ones that have been mentioned majorly are focusing on Earth observation, where when they go out there, they take an image, and then based on the image that they take, once we receive it on the ground, we process it, and then depending if it's agriculture, then we're able to do maybe even develop crops, the crop time maps. If it is natural resource, we're able to monitor the forest. If it's disaster, we're able to map out where flooding is happening. But also more importantly, and Director Shu mentioned that, is issues around navigation, like for those who might know about GPS, global positioning satellites, that every time you want to navigate from one location to the other, sometimes you go to Google Maps and then you just key in the point. But sometimes we lose out that those, the directions that you're receiving, the positioning is guided by satellite. Right. And of course, more importantly, communication, where we're able to communicate. And of course, Starlink has been one of the key proponent that has come to the fore, and of course China also has been working on the constellation. So the value proposition and the applications are quite numerous.
All right, gentlemen, we are going to take a short break now. When we come back, we will look at what the future of space exploration may be for Africa. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Director Shu Yansong, Temideo Onyosun, and Charles Mwangi. Before the break, we looked at some of Africa's successes in space. Let's now look at what the future of space exploration may hold for Africa. Temideo, you spoke about Africa not lagging behind when it comes to space missions, but tell us, when you look at Africa's comparable advantages, what is the most important opportunity that you see for Africa in terms of its space technology and its space ambitions?
Africa is faced with a lot of socioeconomic problems, and majority of these are what you can address with better information, better information that you can get from satellite data and the like. So Africa, it's a very good market for space solution, and I think this is one of the advantages of the continent. This is very obvious in, for example, when you look at the satellite communications market that in Africa today generates about $1.2 billion. Majority of the players in this domain are like the foreign companies that are coming to explore different types of opportunities in the market. Even like newer technologies like what Starlink has. This is becoming this is starting to dominate Africa now with licenses in like 16 countries and hundreds of thousands of users. So the fact that Africa has a lot of challenges that can be addressed with space solution makes it a very valuable region. There are a bunch of other factors like you've got a wide pool of talent. You've got a lot of young people in Africa that can contribute to like the global workforce for space development, and regions like Europe are currently taking advantage of this. There is also like the geographical advantage, which is why some countries are trying to currently capitalize on the geographical location of Kenya, for example, to launch payloads into space. China is, working with Djibouti to be able to launch from Djibouti, and even Turkey is doing the same thing with Somalia. So the geography of Africa also poses some sort of advantage for the region.
Right. So, Director Shu, space development is an important cornerstone for both China and Africa in terms of its relations. And according to the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, the Dakar Action Plan, China and Africa had actively pledged to work for the establishment of a China-Africa Space Cooperation sub-forum under the forum framework. What progress has been made in this area so far? What exactly is China doing to help untap Africa's potential?
Well, I think Africa has a great potential in terms of using remote sensing data, as China has the full advantage of that, because we have the number of fleets that is orbiting the Earth has daily provision of thousands of images. And this can be used for agriculture, food security, can be used for irrigations, study of climate change, precipitation distributions for the whole continent of Africa. I think this is one area of potential that we can work very extensively with all African countries. The other areas is the Chinese Beidou navigation system that has already working together with African countries in terms of its applications. It has a global coverage, can provide precision navigation for all purposes. And another areas that we work together is the telecommunication. The Chinese manned space program is also supported by African ground station that's located in Kenya. So there are a number of areas that we have already working together very extensively. And also China has ambition for lunar missions and Mars missions. These are also open for international collaborations in terms of providing African payloads on board the Chinese mission so that we can achieve a common achievement in lunar exploration and the future research station construction of the lunar surface. And we also have another areas which is very important, which is the establishment of a mechanism between the two sides that we can provide regular communications between the two under the umbrella of China-Africa Forum.
Right. So, Charles, on the African part, though, do African countries collaborate internally to strengthen their continent space program? I mean, does Kenya, for instance, collaborate with Ethiopia or South Africa or Egypt?
Yes, Beatrice, we do. And I can give a case where I think it was August, late August this year that we were invited in South Africa by the South African National Space Agency, SANSA, to visit and see what they're currently doing. And we had a delegation that was drawn from 10 different countries. And the intention was to try and spur the conversation in terms of what is happening within the region and how can we collaborate more. I can also mention of a project that we are currently jointly undertaking, the African Development Satellite. It's a 6-unit satellite with Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria, Sudan, and Uganda, as well as the country, Kenya. And we also have another project we are currently doing it's called the Climate Camera between ourselves, Egypt and Uganda. And besides that, we've had conversations, maybe even all the conversations under the auspices of the African Resource Management Constellation, where Algeria, Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya are supposed to develop a constellation of about 4 satellites. So in terms of the conversation we're having them, it's not in that now we have to actualize the cooperation between the African countries. And of course, one of the other important bodies that is coming to the fore is the African Space Agency. And we're seeing that as an opportunity for us to catalyze more of our activities. And what more importantly is the realization that for us to be able to unlock the potential of space for Africa, that we have to work together, because that is where we would derive a lot of value, and we'll also be able to learn from each other because we are at potentially similar stages of development.
All right, I want to get your final comments here, and let me start off with you, Temideo, because let's look ahead. What are the space ambitions for African countries in the next 10 to 20 years? How do you envision Africa's space moving forward?
Yeah, I think the next couple of decades that'll be interesting. One of the things that we're starting off with is the actual operationalization of the African Space Agency, which is expected to be officially inaugurated next April during the New Space Africa conference in Cairo. So I think for the first time, the continent will be running a space program, and we're expecting a lot of good things to come out of this. Either from facilitating international cooperation, whether it's with China, the US, or Europe, or even implementing continent-wide programs and projects. I think on the national side, with the operationalization of the African Space Agency, we expect that some of the national space agencies would have to rethink their priorities, because especially since some of the things that they're doing can be done at the continental level, we'll expect that some of the national space agencies will start looking inward and focusing on solving like local problems. In addition, we expect to see an increase in the amount of investment going into space program on the continent, more investment from national space agencies and national government. We also expect to see a rise in the number of new space companies operating in the industry ecosystem. As of today, we've got a little over 400 companies operating in both the upstream and downstream segment of the industry. But as space gets gain more popularity on the continent, we expect that we'll see the rise in we'll see new companies coming up.
Right, Charles, as you look ahead as well, what do you also think needs to be done to advance on Africa's space objectives?
I would break it into three different aspects: the people, the infrastructure, and data. And Temideo has alluded to the people element. How do we build the capacity, especially of the young generation that are coming to the fore? And even in Kenya, we've taken deliberate effort to build onto that. How do we also engage the private sector to be more involved in space? And of course, that would talk to the government taking the lead and demonstrating there's a value proposition for space. And then the other one is on infrastructure. I hope to see launch happening in the next couple of years from Africa. I hope to see more satellite assembly, integration, and testing facilities coming to the fore within the region, which would essentially allow us to be able to do the end-to-end manufacturing of our satellites. And of course, now also on the element of rocket development, I hope that we can also get a vehicle. I know South Africa are working towards something. I hope we can get to the level where we are able to launch satellites using our own vehicle. And of course, the other one is the element on data. How then do we build a value proposition? Because sometimes we say we're going to space for, we're not going to space for only for the technology element. It's how we are able to impact lives. I hope to see us developing the infrastructure that is able to ingest and develop products, services, and also solutions that are able to address the societal needs that we have mentioned about agriculture, resource management, on natural resource management, water management, and the like. So if we can unlock that value proposition, I see a lot of business opportunities and job opportunities coming to the forefront of the African region.
Right. So, Director Shu, you have the final word, and I'd like you to look at the continental space ambitions of many countries, and particularly how you envision Africa's space in the next 10 to 20 years, and what needs to be done, the critical steps that need to be done to advance Africa's space objectives.
Well, I think the knowledge of the general public to the space sector is very important. As I said, we turn off space for one day, we lose everything. So that can educate the people that we need space, and more importantly, Africa needs space because the vast areas that it covers, and also we need to have inspiration to the general public so that we can have public support and we have the active commercial sectors to get involved into the space activity. That will be the future of Africa space.
Indeed, gentlemen, thank you all very much for your insights into Africa's space ambitions. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, Charles Mwangi, Acting Director, Space Sector and Technology Development at the Kenya Space Agency, Shu Yansong, Director General of the Asia Pacific Space Cooperation Organization, and Temideo Onyosun, Founder and Managing Director of Space in Africa. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and X. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, it's bye-bye.